Welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche, or old newspapers from long ago that are in the public domain, and we look at them with our modern eyes and modern perspective and see what we can learn from them. So on today's Microfiche Time Capsule, we're looking at an article from the London Magazine on entitled Arguments Against Inoculating Infants by Dr. Percival FRS. I'm not sure what the FRS means. Oh, by the way, this is from April 1768. So, by the way, I should probably warn you, this is a very long article, so it will probably be a very long commentary on it. I do know that it's at least 3 pages, so just brace yourself. It's a beast. But I thought it might be very interesting. Also, I have recently made a video on inoculations, so I am fairly certain I know what they're talking about. So a smallpox inoculation, this was before the vaccination, which was discovered, which was a cowpox vaccination in the late 1790s, so 1797 I think it was. This is 30 years before that. So what they did to inoculate against smallpox was a Chinese technique that they had learned to grind up scabs from the smallpox breakouts and put them up people's nose, so make them sniff them. This would cause people to have a mild reaction, a mild case of smallpox, which 98+% recovered from and had no lasting effects. They had very few scars because the breakouts were so less serious. So I will include some pictures as well of the inoculation and of the results. That was basically the only way to keep people from getting full-blown smallpox. Back in the day, it was quite effective. Most people did not get smallpox after that. This particular article is about how it's not a good idea to inoculate infants. I don't know the science behind this, so I'm interested to see what this doctor has to say. But it may be slightly controversial, so let's take a look. Arguments Against the Inoculation of Children in Early Infancy by Thomas Percival, MD, FRS. So MD I know is medical doctor. Very smart of me, I know. FRS, no clue. If you know, please write it in the comments below. I'm interested. The advantages arising from inoculation are now so universally acknowledged that arguments in support of it are entirely unnecessary. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that he says that, because I feel like there are so many people who are anti-vaccinations, but it shows that there was a time when it was so beneficial that even though this had a 2% death rate, that people were still very, very much for it. So, I find that very interesting. The rapid progress it hath made affords the strongest presumption in favor of its safety and utility, and the well-attested accounts which we every day read of the amazing success with which it is practiced justly remove every prejudice against it, whether political or religious. The patrons of inoculation, therefore, have nothing to fear from its avowed enemies, if any such there be, but they have the utmost reason to guard against the mistaken zeal of its friends, which is more dangerous to its real interest than opposition itself. Interesting. So they're saying that nobody is opposed to the smallpox inoculation. I find this shocking, considering there are people opposed to regular vaccinations that really don't have any side effects, or if they do, they're very, very seldom. And yet people back then were so for it. They're like, yes, get inoculated. Everybody get inoculated. You get an inoculation, and you get an inoculation. And it's just funny to me because people were so excited about it that they wanted to inoculate everybody. And this doctor is saying, calm down, not everybody should get the inoculation. So this person is also mentioning that it can actually be dangerous to give it to everyone. So let's see what he has to say about that. Credulity, fashion, the love of novelty, and a propensity to rush from one extreme to another are principles which govern the generality of mankind. Yeah, okay. Like, we as people tend to be extreme people. calm down, and how unfavorable these have been to the advancement and perpetuity of improvements might be demonstrated by numerous examples. Okay, that's legit. I think we all know that we as human beings tend to be rather extreme. That the artificial method of communicating the smallpox so happily introduced amongst us may not hereafter be added to this disgraceful list. Every sincere advocate for it should exert his warmest endeavors to discourage the wanton levity with which it is at present in many places adopted. That is also legit. Like, they're saying, I know it's the fashion right now to get inoculated. However, not everyone should be inoculated, so let's think about this. For it requires not the spirit of prophecy to foretell that the indiscriminate use of remedies, excess in the cooling regimen, and the total disregard to age, temperament, and habit of body will, in the issue, subvert the reputation and check the progress of one of the most important discoveries in the whole circle of physic. I love that he said it was a very important discovery, and that you can't disregard. Oh, I like the excess of the cooling regimen. So one thing that they mentioned in the earlier article was that the doctor advocated the use of fresh air, particularly cold air, and I personally have the theory that that was to lower the body temperature. But I feel like that was not always indicated because, as you mentioned, excess in the cooling regimen could cause your temperature to sink so far that you might get a worse case of it. I mean, I'm just saying, that's not a good thing. In a late excellent work published by a respectable society of physicians in London, Dr. Maddie hath inserted an essay on the advantages of very early inoculation. He proposes that people should be induced by persuasion and by other encouragement as if necessary to inoculate their children as soon as possible after their birth. Ooh, so I do have children, and their first vaccines were at age 3 months, and yeah, like immediately after birth, like that's very, very early. I agree that's too early, yeah? And this appears to him to be the maximum to which the art of engraftment can be brought, both with respect to individuals and to the public. I'm not sure what he means by engraftment. I'm assuming that they're talking about the inoculation itself. Maybe they called it that. It seems like a weird word for it because you're not grafting anything, you're just blowing powder up people's nose. But the doctor reasoning in support of his hypothesis is more ingenious and plausible than solid and satisfactory. Ingenious, okay. I'm not sure why he called him plausible. I've never called a person plausible before. The doctor's reasoning, okay, his reasoning is plausible. Okay, it's reasonable, but it's not solid, he says. And I apprehend the practice he recommends would considerably diminish the benefits arising from inoculation and would be of dangerous and fatal consequences to mankind. Ooh, he thinks that children will die from this? I shall endeavor, therefore, to point out the disadvantages which would attend the engraftment of newborn children, and shall afterwards make some strictures on Dr. Maddie's argument in favor of it. Okay, so now he lists a whole bunch of things. I did see the list, I did not read it yet. So, this is bound to be fairly lengthy and extremely detailed, so let's see what the good doctor thinks. Number 1. The number of diseases to which infants are incident render them unfit subjects for inoculation. I can kind of see that because children babies who don't have any immunity against anything, is what he's saying. So they can catch anything. So if you inoculate them against smallpox, cause them to get a mild version of it, then what if they get something else at the same time? Because they're just so very subject to getting diseases. Hippocrates, 2,000 years ago, remarked, oh geez, I really should learn Latin at some point. I think I could maybe pronounce it. I don't say that I know what it is. I'll have to look it up. etatibus morbicini sunt juniores. Okay, I am going to look that up. Juniores, I think, means juniors. So, children. Now, Google, don't fail me now. Okay, finally got it. Okay. I do not know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, so any Latin experts feel free to correct me. It means, in English, most diseases are younger than age. Which I think is interesting because it says nothing. So, I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Anyway, moving on. Thank you, Hippocrates. That was not at all helpful. Okay. Okay. And when we consider the great and sudden changes, both external and internal, which they undergo at birth, the laxity and wonderful delicacy of their frame, and the extreme irritability, perhaps depending upon it, the copiousness of the glandular secretions. I'm sorry. The copiousness of the glandular secretions. That means that they have a lot of liquid coming from their body. Particularly, they get runny noses a lot and they drool a lot. I think that's a very... Okay, let me restart that sentence because now I've lost the sense of it because I just... And when we consider the great and sudden changes, both external and internal, which they undergo at birth, okay, that's definitely true. The laxity and wonderful delicacy of their frame, okay, they're small and breakable, and their extreme irritability, perhaps depending upon it, the copiousness of the glandular secretions, with the difficulty of preserving that equilibrium, the least deviation from which affects them. It is a matter of real astonishment that life itself can be supported under a series of such apparently unfavorable circumstances. Okay, so this doctor thinks that it's kind of amazing and miraculous that babies can survive at all because they have just so very many issues and things that are changing so quickly, and that's why we have so many checks of small babies when they're under 1. You know, I mean, you have to go to the doctor what feels like constantly. Scarce had the little stranger been ushered into this world, but he discovered signs of indisposition, by his restlessness, anxiety, crying and vomiting, by the swelling of his belly, and sometimes by convulsions. That's all true, all things that children get. Restlessness, I don't know if I would call a baby restless, but okay. I have seen restless babies, I guess. Anxiety, yeah, like separation anxiety, things like that, yeah. Crying, obviously. Vomiting, yeah, babies do definitely throw up more than adults. Swelling of the belly. Now, neither of my kids had belly swelling. I don't know if you think that that's a common thing. And sometimes convulsions. Now, I think he's talking about like febrile convulsions, like a febrile seizure. So if you, some babies, when they get very high fevers, then they get seizures. But it's not that they are prone to seizures necessarily. It's just that some children get them when they're young. These symptoms arise from the load of meconium with which the stomach and bowels are oppressed, and generally cease when those organs have been greatly evacuated. So he's talking about brand new babies, because meconium is basically I mean, I know what that is. It didn't surprise me because they used the word. It surprised me because I do know what it is. So meconium is basically whatever is in the baby's bowels before it's born. Sometimes they release some of it before they're born, but usually it's afterwards. And it's kind of a blackish, like greenish, kind of tar-like substance. It's very gross looking. And it's from the baby digesting the amniotic fluid. It's their digestive tract trying to turn on, basically, and they digest the amniotic fluid for a couple weeks before they're born, but they don't usually have a bowel movement until after they're born. So he's saying that until all the meconium has been like purged from their system, that they're very prone to these problems. In that case, I would strike anxiety. I don't feel like newborn babies are anxious, because they're not really aware enough to be anxious about anything. They might get freaked out by the difference in environment. It's a sudden difference, but I wouldn't call them anxious. But the jaundice next succeeds and is sometimes complicated with a very acrimonious state of the fluids, as appears by the eruption of little red pustules with which the skin is everywhere loaded. Are you talking about baby acne? Yeah, that's a thing, but it has nothing to do with jaundice. Although it is a skin issue, I guess. Jaundice is impaired liver function, which makes the baby's skin turn yellow. And the cure for that is sunlight. And they get enough sun, or UV rays, really. So they have like UV beds for babies in ICU. And it's very, very common. Like a lot of babies get it. One of mine did. But a little bit of sunlight and she was fine. Eruption of little red pustules. Yeah, that sounds like baby acne. It's also nothing to worry about. You shouldn't really touch it. That goes away on its own. It's more of a hormone imbalance because they had a lot of the mother's hormones when they were in utero. Afterwards, they're kind of purging from their system, and it takes a few weeks for it to even out. And during that time, they can get acne. It's quite common, so. The thrush, watery gripes, and convulsions observe no regular order of time, but attack most infants either singly or collectively according as they are more or less obnoxious to the causes which produce them. Thrush is a fungal infection, usually of the mouth, in this case because they get it from their mothers. Watery gripes, I'm assuming that means like diarrhea, and convulsions, as I talked about, febrile seizures. I don't think it's that common in newborns, though. I mean, because most newborns aren't born with fevers. So it's interesting that they didn't, I feel like they didn't really know what caused them. They were just kind of strange things that babies did. Observe a little more, doctor. The quick growth of children in the first period after birth is likewise a source of numerous ailments. You get sick from growing too fast? I've never heard that one before. Notwithstanding the provision which nature hath made to guard against the inconveniences resulting from it by the laxity of the glandular system, the sudden amplification of the fetus in the matrix of the mother is truly surprising. Amplification, huh? Uh-huh. I'm sorry, that just makes it, because I think of things amplified, I think of sound. That now the baby's being amplified, huh? In the matrix of the mother. You can say uterus, but okay. Dr. Hervey relates that in the deer kind, he observed the punctum secans on the 19th or 20th of November. Why the Latin? Okay. I am just gonna keep going because I don't really want to know. We're talking about deer giving birth. On the 21st, he saw the verniculus, or embryo of the animal, and on the 27th, the fetus was so perfect that the male might be distinguished from the female. The feet were formed and the hoofs were cloven. This rapid growth must be ascribed to the soft and yielding structure of the fetus, to the plenty of nutrition it receives, to its exemption from all discharges, and to the proportionally strong action of its little heart. And as most of these causes continue to exert their influence after birth, though in a less degree, the increment of the young animal proceeds apace, and redundancies are formed, which in a healthy state are carried off by one or the other of the glandular excretions. But a deficiency or access in any of these necessarily produces disease. I think they mean abscess. Deficiency or excess. That's what they mean. Excess of in any of these necessarily produces disease. Redundancies are formed, huh? So they're saying that if after a baby is born that they have all of these glandular secretions, as they call them, but that you have to watch them because they can't have too little or too much of any of them. So I'll agree with that. They are watched pretty closely today, so that's why. And in such feeble, delicate, and irritable subjects, the equilibrium cannot long be preserved. If they are defective, all the complaints which arise from plenitude ensue. The child grows feverish, dull, and comatose. His stomach is disordered, his bowels are oppressed with wind, and if his belly be constipated, he falls into convulsions. Oh, jeez. Yeah, okay, if they're not passing bowel movements properly, yeah, I could see that they could go into convulsions. But it's probably from some sort of birth defect, as they were mentioning. If there's a problem that these things aren't working properly, then they can cause some serious problems, basically. On the other hand, if they are excessive, a diarrhea is produced, aphthay, and severe gripes succeed, and the violent irritation seldom fails on occasion epileptic fits. Fails to occasion epileptic fits. Does it though? I mean, if you get diarrhea, I guess if you're very dehydrated, could you get a seizure? Could you have a seizure from that? Maybe. From this short view of the first period of infancy, I think it must appear evident that inoculation is ill adapted to that tender season of life. Nature, weak and feeble as she then is, can scarcely struggle with the diseases to which she is ordinarily exposed. It is therefore equally cruel and unjust to add to the number with which she is already oppressed, for it is demonstrable from the bills of mortality that 2/3 of all who are born live not to be 2 years old. Jeez, that's awful. And I think it is more than probable that a considerable proportion of these die under the age of 6 weeks. Now, he's a doctor. I'm sure he's seen it all. Oh, that's awful. 2/3 die under the age of 2. Most of those die before they're 6 weeks old. Oh, man. Yeah, okay, that's definitely a good argument against inoculation. I mean, there's so much going on in the early days of development that he just wants to wait until after the baby is more stable, is what it sounds like, because that's a very unstable time and lots of things can happen. So reason number 2, the fears and anxiety of the mother, excited at a time when her strength has been exhausted from the pains of labor, and when every uneasy impression should be cautiously avoided, cannot fail to injure her milk. So a stressed out mother doesn't give very good breast milk. That's actually a decent argument, because back then the baby's survival depended on her producing enough breast milk. And this is a powerful objection to the early engraftment of infants. If a hired nurse be employed, her milk may disagree with the child. She may fall into some disease during the time of inoculation, may be guilty of excess in eating or drinking, or may be under the influence of violent passions, each of which will aggravate the symptoms and increase the danger of the artificial distemper under which the infant labors. I'm sorry, I can't. An influence of violent passions. Okay, yeah, that's going to affect her breast milk, apparently. Okay, so he's basically arguing against inoculating babies while they're still breastfeeding, is what I'm understanding. I think that that's a reasonable request, to say make sure their child is old enough that it's no longer breastfeeding before he gets inoculated. I understand why people would want to do it more quickly if they want to avoid having their child ever get smallpox, full-blown smallpox. But it's like, calm down. If the baby's still breastfeeding, it can wait. Yeah. It has been observed by a very able and number 3. It has been observed by a very able and experienced practitioner, Dr. Dimsdale, that young children have usually a larger share of pustules from inoculation than those who are a little further advanced in life, and that from this circumstance so many have died as to discourage the practice of engrafting the smallpox on such delicate subjects. Now that is a very good reason. Said it's much more deadly to inoculate small children. So I think that's definitely a reasonable request. This fact is not easy to be explained, whether the greater irritability of infants subjects them to be more affected with the engrafted miasma, right, than children of 3 or 4 years old, or whether the larger eruption to which they are liable be owing to the proportionally greater quantity of their fluids, I will not presume to determine. Both causes may possibly conspire to produce this effect. The former by exciting a quicker and increased contraction of the heart and vascular system, the latter by affording a more copious pabulum for the various variolous ferment. smallpox was caused by something called the variola virus. That's what the last part was mean. Miasma, huh? What it sounds like to me, I mean, I guess this sort of makes sense, is that maybe they were giving them too large of a dose of the powder up their nose. So possibly they were infecting them too well, and that the children were then very sick and died from smallpox, which is very sad because smaller children don't need as much as adults do. So, number 4, a considerable number of those who die of the natural disease before the expulsion of the variolous eruption are infants and very young children. Oh, there's a star. Let's look at the star. Star Kirkpatrick's analysis. So let me read that again. A considerable number of those who die of the natural disease before the expulsion of the variolous eruption are infants and very young children. So people who die of smallpox before their skin breaks out? Is that what I'm understanding? This does not arise, as Dr. Kirkpatrick supposes, from the extreme weakness of the vis vitae of infants. I believe that means the vitality, like their life force. For the contraction of their hearts is proportionally stronger than in adults, as the quickness of their growth evinces, but from the high degree of irritability with which their nervous system is endued, hence the convulsive paroxysms which often precede the appearance of the pustules, and which, though regarded by Sydenham as no unfavorable sign, are always alarming, and when they happen to very young infants are frequently fatal. It looks like some people who have smallpox sometimes go into convulsions before they start breaking out in the sores, the pox sores. And that when that happens to very young children, it tends to be fatal. That's really scary. Jeez, like that's definitely a good reason not to inoculate them at such a young age. If such a number of pustules should break out in the mouth or throat as to obstruct function, the disease in all probability would prove fatal. Yeah, that's another thing, because small children really can only eat by sucking. If they're unable to suck because they have too many pox inside their mouth, yeah, that would kill them too. Even a few pox in those parts are highly troublesome and dangerous to infants, for besides the pain and restlessness which they produce, they often terminate in ill-conditioned ulcers. So there's a mark. It says vid, I guess that's also Latin. Schultz on inoculation. Okay. Number 6. Those who are affected with cutaneous diseases, that is, skin diseases, so like eczema, I'm guessing, have been generally regarded as unfavorable subjects for inoculation. Another mark. Vid. Dr. Jurin's account of inoculation. Infancy, therefore, which is seldom unattended with eruptions on the skin, must be an improper period for receiving the smallpox by engraftment. So they're saying a lot of children have breakouts on their skin, and therefore they shouldn't be inoculated because those are usually people who tend to be very much highly affected by the inoculation itself. I don't know why that would be, but if they say so, they've found a correlation. I don't know about causation, but that's very interesting. Number 7, the thickness of the teguments? What the flip is that? I'm going to look it up. This is what Google is for. Teguments. Tegument, an instrument of an organism, especially a parasitic flatworm. That doesn't say ligaments, does it? No, that doesn't make any sense either, right? Alright, I am not quite sure what he's trying to say here. That looks like a T to me if you compare it to the word engraftment above it. It looks like a T. So, or the word thickness is also in earlier. So the thickness of the teguments, which as I Googled it was some sort of flatworm. I really hope that that's not the case. Please don't be a flatworm. Ew, yuck. Of infants, which arises from the quantity of fluids interposed between their fibers, by which the skin is rendered soft, edematous, whatever, and they're perspiring less than children who are capable of using exercise are further objections to very early inoculation. Well, I don't know what teguments are, but I do agree with that, because if you get a fever and you're unable to sweat, then you're going to have a hard time regulating your body temperature, and it could be very dangerous. So that's a good point. That's definitely a good argument. He's coming up with a lot of reasons, you know. Number 8. But the most forcible argument against this practice is deduced from the ill success with which has attended infant inoculation in general. For it appears by Dr. Jurin's account of the progress of inoculation in Great Britain from 1721 to 1726, and by Dr. Schweitzer's continuation of it in 1728, that out of 24 children under 1 year old who received the smallpox by engraftment, 2 died, and 4 out of 34 betwixt 1 and 2 years of age. So 2 out of 24 children, yeah, that's kind of high. That's definitely more than 2% like it was in the general population. 2 out of 24 is more like 10%. Although it's not quite 10%, it's like 8 point something. But it's definitely higher than the 2% that they normally would expect. And then they said 4 out of 34 between 1 and 2 also passed away, which is also pretty close to 10%. It's actually above 10%, so that's definitely a good reason. Having thus pointed out some of the principal objections to the early inoculations of infants, I shall make a few remarks on Dr. Mattey's ingenious essay in favor of it. After enumerating the advantages with which infancy has in regard to the smallpox, the doctor sums up the whole by saying, if there is a period in which the machine is in perfect state, it certainly is immediately before it begins to be spoiled, or at the first period after nativity. This assertion I apprehend as repugnant to reason and anatomy and experience. It seems to be a general law of nature that all organified bodies should advance by progressive stages to the acme. Does that really say acme? Okay, it means a peak. Okay, yeah. By progressive stages to the acme or state of perfection. I did look this up. Acme means peak, like perfect in this sense. To the peak or state of perfection, okay. And should then decline by the same regular gradation. I think it's funny that they use the word acme. Okay. A plant, when it first springs out of the ground, is frail and tender by degrees. By degrees, the stem thickens, the leaves expand themselves, the juices are concocted, the flower opens, the feed is formed, ripened, and shed. And when the office assigned it by the sovereign creator is thus accomplished, it droops, withers, and falls into decay. The animal world flourishes still more striking proofs of the truth of this observation, and I know nothing which contributes more to the beauty and harmony of the universe, or affords a more admirable display of the wisdom of its great author than the order and uniformity with which these successive changes are carried on amongst the different classes of beings. Sorry, that's a little hard to read. I find it slightly amusing that he is comparing people to flower. I'm not sure if he really meant to do that. But he's saying that the peak of your physical body is not right after you're born. That you grow and you bloom, and then you're at your peak, and then you wither and die. So, you got a point there. You have to develop and you have to grow to a certain point before you can stop developing. Physically anyway. Okay. From the researchers, this is really hard to read. Let's see how well I can read this. From the researches of anatomists into the structure of the human body, it is evident that our machine in instance is comparatively extremely imperfect. That our machine in infancy is comparatively extremely imperfect, that its parts are disproportioned and its organs incapable of those functions which they are designed in future life to perform. I agree with this. You are not at your peak physically right after you're born. Most newborns have to be very carefully watched and very carefully cared for in order to thrive. That's not really the good, like, most perfect time to inoculate someone. The head of a newborn child bears a much larger proportion to the bulk of his body than that of an adult, the former being as 1:3, the latter only 1:8, and this, joined by the remarkable laxity of the fibers in infancy, oh, jeez, this is hard to read, is the reason perhaps of the excessive irritability, the excessive irritability with which the body is then endued, and which lays a foundation for numerous diseases. I am so proud of myself for being able to read that. Sorry, it really looks as horrible as as you're seeing it on the screen. I do not have a better view than you do, so. The liver and pancreas are so immensely distended as to fill up almost the whole cavity of the abdomen, and the copiousness of their secretions is equal to their bulk. The bile, cystic, and stepatic, I'm not familiar with, is almost insipid and so inert that it is incapable either of promoting digestion or neutralizing those acidities, which the weakness of the stomach and the, I don't think this is a word we use anymore, accescency, I'm looking this up. Turning sour, slightly sour, acidulous. Okay, so it means acidic. Antiquated words. I don't know this word, but it means acidic. Accescency. Okay, that sounds like it's actually correct. Of the foods of infants generated in the prime vitae, early life, yeah? Hence probably arise the crudities, flatulency, gripes, apathy, and convulsions to which children at that tender age are particularly exposed. I'm not even gonna try and interpret this, because they're basically saying your liver is ginormous and it's working too hard. Sure, if you say so. Moving on. The heart, with respect to the vascular system, is both stronger and more bulky in infancy than in afterlife. And there's a star. Let's look at the star. By the curious tables, it's a long star. By the curious tables of Dr. Brian Robinson, it appears that the weight of the heart with respect to the weight of the body is greater in a child than in a man, in the proportion of 3:2. That the quantity of blood which flows through the heart in a given time is greater in children than in grown bodies, in the proportion of 20:7, which is the proportion of their pulses in a minute, and that the velocity of the blood is greater in a child than in a man, in a proportion of 80:7. Or 80:70, I'm hoping is what it says. Obviously, I can't read it any better than you can. By this means the blood is propelled with greater force, and as the arteries at that period have less firmness and density than the veins, it appears by Dr. Winteringham's experiments that they are then most yielding and distentile. So, okay, it's just technical stuff about the heart. I'm not going to be overly concerned about it. And both these causes equally conspire to promote and quicken the growth of the young animal. But wise and necessary as this provision of nature is, it unavoidably exposes the infant to all the dangers which arises from a plethora, and must be considered as a present imperfection, however well adapted it may be to those progressive changes, which advance him from childhood to maturity. For by degrees the heart abates of its proportional force, and the arteries acquire the greatest amplitude. At this period, the moving powers of the machine are equally balanced, and the body seems to enjoy, for a while, a state of rest. But the delicate equilibrium cannot long be maintained. The heart grows feeble and languid, and arteries gradually contract themselves. A venous plenitude ensues, and old age closes the scene. So they're saying that your heart develops as you grow, develops to a point where it becomes basically perfect, and then it starts to deteriorate again. I think everyone can agree with that. That's kind of how bodies work. Yeah? You grow to a certain state, you're good for a while, and then it gets worse. But analogy may deceive us, and observations of anatomists may be doubtful. Experience, however, carries conviction along with it, and incontestably demonstrates that the human body, contrary to the assertion of Dr. Matty, is most imperfect in the first period after nativity, for it is universally acknowledged that infancy is liable to a much greater variety of maladies than at any other stage of life. This can arise only from the extreme delicacy of the structure and disproportion of the parts of newborn children, and both the cause and effect in this instant are marks of frailty and imperfection. Yeah, like you can also, environment plays a big role as well, because if they're exposed to chemicals or something like that that are harmful to like an adult may not feel them, but a child could very well. I was thinking of like black mold and like arsenic, which back then was used in like wallpaper. I think this was pre that period, but still, like, there were all sorts of toxic chemicals nobody was aware of, and also the way that they're taken care of. If somebody pulls on their joints a lot and they causes them to pull out of joint, I mean, that's kind of fairly easy in a very small child, but it's a lot harder on an adult, yeah? So, I mean, lots of things can disfigure a child as well, so, I mean, they're just more frail, like they're just they're more breakable, they're more breakable than an adult is. That's just all there is to it. Convulsions in young babes, says Dr. Maddie, seem to not be so much a disease as an indication of some disorder in the bowels, or the effort of nature to expel some enemy. The observation is in general just, for I believe the true idiopathic convulsions happen very rarely, but though somewhat less alarming on this account, these fits are always attended in such feeble and delicate subjects with immediate danger. Okay, yeah, if a baby has a seizure, then yeah, it can definitely be a bad thing. It'd be an indication of something very, very bad. So many, it is well known, have expired under them, while others who have struggled through with great difficulty have been so debilitated and their faculties so impaired that the effects have been perceptible during the remaining part of their lives. So things can affect you, like different in conditions as well. Let's look at this. T. Dimsdale on inoculation. Okay. That disposition of the intestinal tube to excoriate, which arises from the too great accescency of milk or vegetable aliments, I can get these words, they're very antiquated, but I will get them, is easily corrected by magnesia, lime water, oil, and by small quantities of broth and or animal food. Interesting. Add some magnesia. The remedies which Dr. Maddie hath here pointed out are very judicious and proper, but their effect are much more uncertain than he seems to apprehend. The ailments of children are generally very complicated, and the indications of cure are often doubtful and obscure. Yeah, that's true, because you don't necessarily know why they're having these symptoms. In their irritable bodies, one symptom frequently brings on a variety of others, sometimes connected with the original one, at other times, to all appearance, totally dissimilar. Yeah, I think that any doctor who's ever treated a child could definitely echo that one. And these symptom of symptoms, as they are termed, do not always cease when the cause which first produced them is removed. This every physician experiences who is conversant with the diseases of infants, and it necessarily occasions in his treatment of them a good deal of difficulty and confusion. So sometimes the secondary symptoms linger even after the first condition has been dealt with and cured, whatever it may be. The multitude of disorders which children are liable to ought certainly to induce us to attempt lessening the number of them at least by one. This argument which Dr. Maddie hath advanced in favor of infant inoculation I consider as one of the most powerful objections against it, but as I have before enlarged upon it, I shall in this place only observe that the smallpox is a distemper, to which children in the first period of life are very exposed, because at that tender age they are neither in the way of infection, nor are they very much disposed to receive it. So he's saying, well, he just said don't add to it, which means don't inoculate them at that age because it's dangerous. Yeah. From the lists of Dr. Jurin, Dr. Schweitzer, and Dr. Maddie finds that 9 out of 273, or 1 out of 30, inoculated under 5 years of age died between the years 1721 and 1728. But if the doctor had confined himself, as he ought to have done, to the list of those who died by inoculation under 1 year old, he would have found the proportion to be vastly greater, viz. No less than 1 in 12. But as even 1 in 30 is a great mortality, and as the operation in grown people during the period appears to have carried off only 1 in 50, Dr. Maddie endeavors to obviate that objection in the following manner. As so many more children under 5 years old die of different disorders than at any other age, it is more than probable that several, perhaps most of these 9, would have died though they had not been inoculated. How does he know that? Like, that's kind of presumptuous. So the doctor writing this objection to the original doctor's findings is saying that, listen, the mortality was much higher in small children than it was in adults. 1 in 50 in adults, like I said, 2%. But in small children, it was 1 in 12, which is quite high. I mean, I don't think they would accept something like that if it were for adults with 1 in 12. So. But I would ask the doctor, where is the justice or propriety of engrafting the smallpox at a period when the risk is so great of other dangerous distempers acceding to it? For slightly as this artificial disease is now regarded, it is of itself sufficient for the feeble powers of nature in early infancy to struggle with. So he's saying that even though we consider it kind of an easy thing to get over as an adult, for children it's not. So he's definitely arguing against it. The second part of Dr. Maddie's essay displays the political advantages which would accrue from the early inoculation of infants. But if it be evident from what has been advanced that the practice he recommends is prejudicial to individuals, it will require no arguments to prove that it must be equally so to the public. Not sure what to do with that. Okay. I cannot, however, forbear to express my admiration of the benevolent though chimerical expectation of the doctor that by engrafting the smallpox in every newborn child, this loathsome and destructive distemper would, in less than half a century, be utterly extirpated. So he's saying, he can't help but say, he's pretty optimistic that, if you inoculated every small child, then nobody would ever get it. So I understand why he wanted to, but the other doctor says it's too dangerous. Yeah. Happy would it be for us, says he, if this desirable revolution could be brought about in our days, and if prosperity, remembering only the name of this fatal scourge, should have it in their power to say, the smallpox, which like the leprosy of the ancients is now only known by their descriptions, was in the 12th century spread all over Europe by ignorant and enthusiastic bands, and by a wiser generation extirpated in the 18th. Yeah, they're comparing it to leprosy. To conclude, though infants are less proper subjects for receiving the smallpox by engraftment than children a little further advanced in life, yet it must be confessed that such circumstances may occur as to render the inoculation of them highly expedient and advisable. In such cases, however, I think the age of 2 or 3 months is preferable to the period Dr. Maddie recommends, for it will then be too early to apprehend any disturbance from dentition, and yet the child will have surmounted some of the diseases peculiar to the first stages of his existence. 2 or 3 months, huh? So they're saying then that at that point it will be too early for the child to have gotten any teeth, but that he will have had been exposed to some of the more endemic viruses and maybe have gotten over them already. I am not a doctor. No, I am not a doctor. Okay, the chylopiotic organs, I have no idea what that means, will also by that time have been so strengthened by their exercise and habit as to discharge their functions with some degree of regularity. I'm assuming that means the digestive organs, since he's talking about regularity. But the fittest season for inoculation seems to be between the ages of 3 and 7. Thank you. In healthy children, and 4 and 7 in those who are tender and delicate. Oh, that's sweet. He's like, oh, your 3-year-old is kind of delicate and gets sick a lot, then wait until they're 4. 3 and 7, I think that that's reasonable. The powers of nature are then sufficiently vigorous, perspiration is free and copious, and irritability of the body is greatly diminished. The viscera are found and unobstructed. The mind, though active and lively, is not disturbed by violent emotions. That's true. That's kind of the end of the temper tantrums, The teguments are properly extenuated, whatever that means, and the fibers are neither too tense nor too lax, for for the variolous eruption. To these important advantages may be added that at this age the child is both a proper subject for preparatory medicines and for such as may be deemed necessary during the course of the distemper. It is no wonder, therefore, that the practice of inoculation is attended at this period with most success. It is seriously to be lamented that the precious opportunity is not universally embraced. Manchester, April 12, 1768. Wow, that was a lot. That was a lot. But I feel like I've commented on most of it enough that I don't necessarily need to say much here, except just this very last part. And it is seriously to be lamented that the precious opportunity is not universally embraced. Too bad not everybody inoculates their children, is what he's saying. Yeah, I'll echo that. Too bad not everyone vaccinates their children. I think you should. Because smallpox has been eradicated. Today, we are not afraid of it. We don't have to be inoculated with something that has a 2% chance of killing us in order to not get full-blown smallpox. I'm very grateful for modern medicine, and I would just encourage everyone here to get their vaccines if they have the opportunity. Please be vaccinated if you can. That's all. I'm not going to go up on my high horse and start like ranting and raving, but I do just want to say, please listen to the advice of your doctor, and I also appreciate that they did look into inoculating infants with the hope that it would have been okay. But this doctor very thoroughly writes that it wasn't okay. It was too much, and it was not the right time of life for the infant. It sounds to me like this doctor is a pediatrician. I know that they didn't really have those back then, but he seems to know a lot about the development of children. So whether or not he was, I don't know, but I think that the way he talks makes it sound like he knows what he's talking about, and from somebody who has small children and has seen their development, that it's pretty spot on. So I appreciate his opinion, and I'm very grateful that they were so careful at the time to test the inoculation as best as they possibly could. So I hope that everyone listened to his advice, because 1 in 12 death rate is too high. Although, I must admit, his sample size was extremely small, but at the same time, it's not worth it. It's not worth the risk. And I personally would not have wanted to inoculate my newborn. As he said, let them wean off of breast milk first, eating solid foods and talking and no longer having temper tantrums. Then you can inoculate them and it will go much better. So, I hope you enjoyed this Microfiche time capsule from the 18th century. And please come back, join us again, like and subscribe the video, and I hope to see you in the next video.